I've got my coffee, I got my biscuit, we must be ready to record. Good, you know what I was doing. All right, welcome back to Affix, Bryan and I's weekly podcast that we do instead of going for coffee every day. We don't mean to talk probably so much about coronavirus, but it sure does dominate the news, and there's a lot of stuff happening there. So we're going to do a little bit of reflections on last week, where we're up to, what may have come to pass, what may not have. And then we do want to actually talk about non-coronavirus stuff. So we'll talk about one of our favorite crazy authors, Bryan Caplan, and some thoughts on Plato and the dialogue method of query, I think. I don't know. Bryan's way smarter than me.
We'll get to that. Reflecting on last week, we talked around vaccine distribution systems, and the US seemed to be a bit further ahead of the UK, even though the UK were properly targeting people, and that no longer seems to be the case.
Yes, well, it depends where you draw the line of distribution, but yes, they're very good at getting vaccines from the factory into the warehouses and very, very bad at getting them from the warehouses into people's arms. Some numbers I'm looking at say about 20% of distributed vaccines have actually been administered. That's pretty poor.
Yeah, you'd never think that the actual hospital systems in the US would be poor compared to their corporate systems, right?
Ouch, that's a bit of a low blow. To be fair, perhaps those hospital systems have other things that they're dealing with right now.
Quite possibly.
But I think they are trying to distribute it through CVS, through the chemist chains there. I don't think you have to go to hospital to get this vaccine. But even that is proving to be much more difficult than anyone expected.
There was an interesting stat that Tyler Cowen threw out on his website, Martian Revolution, where a surprising percent of the people targeted in the first group to get vaccines were not participating. So they were really hesitant. So it's like, okay, we've set aside all these vaccines and they're only going to go to Group A before we get to anyone else. And only like 20% of people in Group A are going and having a crack at it.
Yeah, that's certainly part of the problem. And to exacerbate that, Zvi's favourite worst person in the world, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, seems to be more concerned about people jumping the queue than about actually getting shots into arms. So no one in the first group wants this vaccine. I have vaccine about to spoil, so I'm just going to give it to whoever walks past my CVS so that someone gets vaccinated. Those people are being, I don't know whether they're being prosecuted, but they're having heavy political pressure on, you should just be throwing those vaccines away rather than giving it to the wrong, less deserving people.
Oh my God. So here's a thing that I also reflected I couldn't believe didn't come up last week, which was the Copenhagen interpretation of ethics.
Yes, it does seem quite central to everything that I see in the world right now.
So do you want to give a quick overview of the Copenhagen interpretation?
I'm just going to read it directly off the website where I first discovered this. The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics says that you can have a particle spinning clockwise and counterclockwise at the same time until you look at it, at which point it definitely becomes one or the other. The theory claims that observing reality fundamentally changes it. So this is weird and quantum-y, and if Jeff or Oliver are listening right now, they're going to get it instantly, and everyone else is like, yeah, quantum, that's pretty hard. Like I am.
You change the outcome by measuring it. What?
That makes no sense. But it does like experimentally. I've read a lot of experiments that I barely understand, and it does really genuinely seem to be true and have real impact on the world, that you do actually change the results of quantum experiments by measuring them. So the Copenhagen interpretation of ethics says that when you observe or interact with a problem in any way, you can now be blamed for it. At the very least, you're to blame for not doing more. Even if you don't make the problem worse, even if you make it slightly better, the ethical burden of the problem falls on you as soon as you observe it. In particular, if you interact with a problem and benefit for it, you are a complete monster. I don't subscribe to this school of thought, but it seems popular. I mean, I might subscribe to it a little bit, or at least instinctively I do. There seems to be something in the natural interpretation of ethics that seems to really want to assign blame, and it's hard to get away from, even when you know that seems ridiculous and that you could get a better utilitarian outcome by not assigning blame, by doing things a bit better, even if not optimally better.
Yeah, there's this excellent point in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and he goes through a lot of different psychological biases that exist, and one of those that he calls out is called what you see is all there is. And by interacting with something, it then becomes seen, and that's where you get held accountable to outcomes on it. If you never interacted with it, it was never seen, so therefore there was no ethical complications.
This seems to be a common problem. I want to read out an example, actually, just to make it a little bit more clear what we're talking about. In 2010, New York randomly chose homeless applicants to participate in its home-based program. It was something designed to help homeless people get out of homelessness. And based on their applicants, they were randomly assigned either to the new program or to the old system so that they could get a randomized control experiment on which works and which doesn't. Now, they only had funding to put, let's say, 500 people through the home-based program. So they had to choose somehow that people were going to get into this, and they decided to collect extra information by randomizing that based on how people applied. So this was thought of as monstrous. They should immediately stop this experiment. The city shouldn't be making guinea pigs out of its most vulnerable, which is a fair sentiment. But like on March 11, 2012, the vast majority of people did nothing to help homeless people. I did nothing to help homeless people. I'm betting you did nothing to help homeless people. Some people tried to help homeless people, but they didn't maximally help all the homeless people, and they benefited in the form of data collection from not helping some of those homeless people. So they are therefore terrible people treating their poor as guinea pigs and are blameworthy for the situation of poverty in general. Now that they've interacted with the problem, it's their fault.
Classic. So I'll leave it to the listeners to apply that to various facets of their life, of what they observe as well as what they heard in the previous podcast. That's a quick wrap up of what we discussed on coronavirus, on ZV. And I think going back to episode 0 as well, I just wanted to check in with Chris on how his job's going, because we did allude to the beers in the fridge and it being okay. And it seems that no one really wants them.
Ah, man, I am the literal worst bad influence. I tried so hard. In the office on New Year's Eve, there was 2 undergrads, 3 grads, and Chris Carter, the senior developer, obviously the most senior person left in the office at 4 o'clock on New Year's Eve. And I'm like, what do you reckon, guys? 4 o'clock, New Year's Eve, I reckon we stop work and have some beers. I would have thought undergrads and grads would be all over that. It turns out not even one taker. Not even one. I don't want to say this too loudly, Brian, but I have a feeling that all the software engineers I work with might be a bunch of nerds.
I think they're just paid too well. When I was a grad, or especially when I was an undergrad, I would be jumping at the chance to get anything free, especially as something as high value as beer.
Right? Beers cost $3 or $4. That's a significant amount of work when you're an undergrad.
So there we go. I think that's a good wrap up on the podcast so far and topics that have come up in their interim.
Our major topic this week is Bryan Caplan and a particular article of his around are laws ethical? Do they factor into ethical decision making? And as an introduction to Bryan Caplan, he's another George Mason University professor alongside a lot of the people we read, Robin Hanson, Tyler Cowen, Scott Sumner's JMU. I knew there was a Scott in there somewhere. Alex Tabarrok. And Caplan is quite engaging to read, extremely well reasoned, has a very powerful mind, can really think things through very, very logically and read a lot of academics and come to a lot of good conclusions, and completely insane. So he is one of the most enjoyable people to read with because he is very, very convincing, and I disagree with him a lot. So I think it is important to... it's hard to disagree with him. He does write so well, and you're like, man, that makes a lot of sense when you put it like that. And then you think it through, and I'm like, do I actually think that? No, I don't actually think that. You're crazy, Bryan Caplan.
There was this really important point Tyler Cowen made when reflecting on 10 Rules for Life, when that was a big meme going around after Jordan Peterson did it. And one of his rules was find a way to engage with people you disagree with. And Bryan Caplan is a really easy person to engage with who you disagree with. He lays out his arguments well, you can understand them, but God, they're crazy.
Yeah, if I can think I can get to the heart of his craziness. No, he's a full-on libertarian. Like a lot of the GMU professors tend to lean libertarian, I would think it would be fair to say. I think that market-based solutions can solve a lot of the problems that we see in vaccine distribution or governance generally. But Bryan Caplan would be full-on, we should have basically no government, everyone should be a law unto themselves, hardcore libertarian. And it seems to be, at least partially, that he is so in control of his own mind that he cannot even imagine, even with the point of like literal chemical addiction to opioids, he seems to just view that as that's a choice. If a person wants to make a choice to take the 5th shot of heroin into the arm, they're making a rational economic choice, and who am I to stop them? They have weighed up the pros and cons. They probably know they're going to lose their job. They probably know they're going to lose their family, and they still want that heroin. Give them the heroin. That is the ethical correct thing to do because they are an independent person, and it would be too paternal of me to stop them from doing that. I actually almost believe that if Bryan Caplan was addicted to heroin, he would, late one night at about 2 a.m. after his 4th shot, he would do some sums and be like, man, this 5th shot is going to cost me my family, willing to give up that. It's going to cost me my job, willing to give up that. But it's also going to cost me my house. And like on balance, and then you get a whiteboard out and you'd write it in the pros and cons list and be like, he would probably have the steel trap mind to be like, you know what, I'm not going to do the 5th shot of heroin. I think that is too much to give up. I'm going clean. And like that, cold turkey, he would be clean. I honestly believe he might be capable of that.
He does seem to be a man with a lot of willpower.
Just, yeah, inhuman amounts of willpower. Like I remember, there's a totally different example. He had some problem with his spine or sitting or something, and he just went on this like 6-month quest to find the perfect chair, and he bought 50 different chairs and different pillow configurations and wrote it all down in a notebook and worked out how much in pain he was after a few days, this, that, and the other, and like eventually he sort of fixed it. In no way could I commit to a project like that in any way, that level of optimization. I think he literally bought 12 different chairs to sit in and just tried each of them for a week. I could not possibly do that.
Yeah, it says a bit about the man. Anyway, it's very fun to read, at the very least. A lot of the rationalist community can be fairly right-wing, but, we're educated people in Australia, so therefore we're going to have a bit of a left-wing bias towards things.
I live in Canberra, for goodness sake.
So it's fun to engage with these kind of right-wing ideals that are so further beyond anything that you see in Australia, really.
Yeah. That level of libertarian. Obviously, the US is a much more free market capitalist kind of society than Australia, generally speaking, in terms of labour laws, particularly, you could point to, and healthcare system, which works out terribly. But Caplan is like, we are nowhere near libertarian enough. And we'll make the distinction from the traditional right, which tends to have a lot of religious overtones, particularly in Australia and the US. And the libertarian right is almost a third point on the triangle. They do seem to think of themselves as different. They like the free market ideology of the conservative parties, generally speaking, but they do not like the conservative social aspect that goes with it. So, Silicon Valley libertarianism seems to be common, although there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley who are very heavily left government interventionist. But that level of libertarianism I can kind of agree with, because a lot of the Silicon Valley libertarian is that the market solves problems better than most things, and then you can just tax it and redistribute it. Don't put in programs that deliberately give people 4 apples and 6 bananas because you think you've worked out that that's the perfect healthy diet. Just give them some money. Like, if people are making a bunch of money, let them make a bunch of money and then take that money off them and give them to poor people. I can sort of get behind that view of libertarianism.
So yeah, this week for Bryan Caplan, we're going to be delving into a specific article of his called The Righteous Scofflaw, which is one that he linked from a recent post about when may we be happy. But The Righteous Scofflaw is essentially diving into another author's writings on the topic of 3 leading theories of justified law breaking. The author is Ilya Somin, and cuts it down into different slices, being there's a strong presumption that you should follow the law. It's only justified under desperate circumstances.
Yep, steal a loaf of bread to feed your family.
Exactly. There's another that is there's a weak presumption that following the law itself is moral, which is legality itself only marginally tips the scales in terms of righteousness. If obeying a law is inconvenient and violating it is unlikely to harm anyone, you can believe that that violation is morally justified. So if you break the speed limit by a couple of k's an hour, who cares? You're not likely to be caught, or at the very least prosecuted, for breaking it by going 103 in a 100 zone, and you're not really endangering anyone that much beyond what you'd be doing at 100. Chris, as an engineer, you might have some different calculations on deceleration and what that means.
If we want to get into the engineering, and I don't know whether this is going to make the cut, but a remarkable amount of your speed is washed off in the last second or so. So it takes a very long time to get from 120 down to 80 k's an hour, and then not that long to get from 80 k's an hour down to 0 k's an hour. So by doing an extra 10 k's an hour, you can actually increase your collision speed based on your reaction times by 20 or 30 k's an hour, which could be quite lethal.
There you go. Just wanted to call that out. I remember that from high school physics, and it's a good one as to why following the speed limits can be okay. I assume actually when they're doing speed limits, they kind of factor that in.
The thing that's curious to me about speed limits is they essentially haven't changed in the past, I don't know how long, 40 years, 50 years, maybe? And like cars' brakes, we do not use drum brakes very much anymore. We have really nice disc brakes on really stable chassis with, stability control and anti-lock brake systems and everything. So if it was really based on the level of reaction time to expected collision speed, you would think that we could definitely increase the speed limits by 20, 30, 40 k's an hour just based on new technology. But we don't seem to have done that. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent.
No, that's fun. This is what we talk about. We love the tangents. And this actually kind of ties nicely into our discussion about trading off lives versus productivity and whatever. There's going to be some savings there in terms of productivity if you increase the speed limit. But you know what? We'd prefer to have the lives. Target zero and all that.
That's also true. To take the really cold-nosed rational argument kind of thing, when productivity was hard to win and lives were cheap, back in the Middle Ages particularly, when lives were very cheap, or even in the 40s when we would send thousands of people to war to die, and the 50s and 60s when everything was just drastically unsafe, the amount of productivity that you would have to lose to save a life may have been untenable. And now we're like 20 k's an hour down the highway. Yeah, okay, it takes me 3 hours to drive and actually claim my coffee bet from Bryan rather than 2.5 hours if I could do 150 k's down the Hume. That is not a worthwhile trade-off for the risk to my life.
It's come up in conversations in my personal life a few times around, well, why can't we speed up the speed limit, especially on the Hume Freeway? I've even seen race car drivers talk about your attention is much more focused when you're going around 130, 140 instead of going at 110. So therefore, you're less likely to fall asleep at the wheel. There's some interesting arguments around that. Or we've got all these safety barriers up now in the last, 5-10 years, all running along almost the entire length of the Hume Freeway. Could that not just allow us to increase the speed limit? No, we're not trading off for time here. We're trading off for lives, absolute lives, I guess.
Just to completely throw a cat amongst the pigeons, but like Germany runs autobahns, right? And I actually think that their road toll per capita is lower than Australia's. So if Germany can have literally unlimited highways and have fewer deaths than Australia, possibly we're approaching this problem wrong. And it's not just a manic focus on speed limits that we should be doing, but I don't know, quality of cars, quality of roads, driver education. There's a million factors that could be causing this to be better in Germany than here. Everyone drives Porsches rather than clapped out Holden Utes.
So anyway, getting back to Caplan's argument.
Strong presumption of you should obey the law. So this would say that unless you have sort of a desperate need, that obeying the law should be the ethical default. And I think the interesting thing to split out on Caplan's arguments and arguments about the law is like when you say what should you do, you can approach that as an ethical question because like what is the morally righteous thing to do and like what should you do just to fit into society? And these are somewhat different questions even though they're worded exactly the same. And so the strong presumption is that you should not break the law unless you have a really desperate need to. So, stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family is the classic example. Certainly since World War II, when a lot of German soldiers were perfectly obeying the law of their country and causing mass harm to other people, that is following the law, but completely unethical. So there are definitely many examples that we can all easily think of where the law and ethics comes into conflict.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of in ethics, there's social contract theory, where basically we're just working with each other and the moral thing is to get along with each other and further society. And are laws actually proper representations of that social contract, or where can you deviate from the laws and still be within the bounds of the social contract?
Yeah, sure. And maybe speeding 5 or 10 k's over seems like you probably are within the bounds of the social contract.
Totally. Where Caplan gets this, he really applies it into the world of immigration, especially illegal immigration.
And so Caplan thinks that we should basically have open borders and that it is a needless cruelty to stop people immigrating to rich countries to benefit their lives, that we should not have any immigration control. People should be able to work and live wherever they want in the world. To someone born in Haiti through no fault of their own, they're pretty much cursed to a life of poverty just because the systems in Haiti pretty much bring their background. And it's not because Haitian people are bad, it's because they're in Haiti. And if a Haitian moves to the United States, he can easily become 10 times more productive and earn 10 times more money for him and his family without any change to his personal abilities or skills or anything, simply because of the systems available in the US versus the systems available in Haiti. And it is incredibly cruel not to allow him to do that.
Yeah. Bryan Caplan argues that regardless of whether you've got a strong presumption or a weak presumption or even no presumption on the ethical stance of laws in society, illegal immigrants fall within each of those presumptions. You should give them the ethical, moral right to illegally immigrate, essentially.
Absolutely. What could be a more dire need than starving to death in a poor country from no fault of your own versus being able to live a fairly comfortable life in a different country? That feels like desperate need. That feels like stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family, just about.
100%. And it's an interesting take on it. I think ignoring second, third, fourth order effects, it is a pretty logical take on it. And it's always the second, third, fourth order effects that complicate the discussion on illegal immigration. If you're breaking the law, how much of a precedent does that set to your social contract that it's just okay to break all laws? Does it embed the no presumption on the ethical stance of laws? I don't know.
Which is Caplan's presumption, that there is no ethical weight to laws whatsoever because he is a law unto himself and he is a true rugged individualist and, you can't stop him.
I wonder what his thoughts are on just general compliance with contracts. Because a lot of libertarians themselves are strong contractualists. So they say we should just contract one-on-one with each other. But Bryan Caplan just seems to be a guy I contract with myself and everyone deals with the consequences.
Yeah, that is interesting. We would have to think that he would think that contracts are important because I just don't see how you get anywhere without some kind of level of truth into society. Like for a level of trade, if you just promise to trade something and then never uphold your end of the bargain, it creates some pretty perverse incentives, and I think nothing gets done under those situations. I don't think he'd like that, but yeah, he sure doesn't seem to like laws or social pressure or other people very much.
Well, he seems to like other people.
No, he does. He's actually very friendly. That's why he's so good to read. He's not a curmudgeon by any stretch of the imagination. He's a happy-go-lucky guy. He enjoys life. He goes on holidays. He loves his family very clearly.
Yeah, a few of the other pieces in his When May We Be Happy was reflecting on the impacts on his personal happiness because he was getting alienated from his friends during coronavirus. And he read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People because he wants more friends. He wants to be a friendly guy. And he seems like a friendly guy. He's got a very nice smile. I'll give him that.
He does have a very nice smile. And when you hear him talk on podcasts, he always sounds like he's enjoying himself.
So what else did you want to say on this one, Chris?
The thing I find important about laws is just acting as a shared understanding of the world. I think it's all well and good to say, with infinite thought and infinite memory and infinite communication, maybe laws don't figure into ethics at all. But in terms of a well-run society, just the fact that I can rely on you to obey most laws and you can rely on me to obey most laws, it just smooths things out and requires a hell of a lot less thought every second of every day of every hour. I sort of can come up with an assumption that if I buy a good from a store, it's going to obey all relevant laws for safety and health, that I don't have to be like, oh, well, I better check the reviews and I better ask my friends and I better delve into the background of the entrepreneur and see if he's had any failed businesses in the past and get all the information before I buy from this because, there's no ethical presumption that he won't try to poison me in order to to increase his profit margins. And, there's free market methods that can sort that all out in terms of reviews, but it just seems to create a load more work than just like, it's illegal to poison people. Don't do that.
Yeah, it frees up your life in terms of not having to worry about that and gives you more life hours.
Yeah.
At the same time, by setting a great anchor point, it tweaks the equation in any prisoner's dilemma, because you can assume more freely that it's going to be a cooperate situation rather than a cooperate defect.
Yep, exactly. Even not in cooperate defect, but like for the road rules, something that irritates me. Some people can be extremely courteous to the point of giving way to me when they have right of way. And it just irritates me. You have right of way, car. You are perfectly within your rights to drive through. I've got the give way sign. I will stop and give way. By you stopping and waiting for me, you're adding a whole lot of confusion, because I don't know, are you stopping and waiting for me? If I do roll through, are you going to accelerate and kill me? Should I stop? Should I go? It just slows everything down. I would be perfectly happy being like, I don't have right of way. I'm going to stop at the intersection. The car's going to go through, and then I'm going to get on my way. The car slowing down and trying to wave me through just creates all this conflict and difficulty in my mind. They're actually trying to do a nice thing, but they are no longer obeying the law, which makes things more complicated.
Yeah, it goes against the default expectations and makes your life worse, which is not how I ever see Caplan frame paternalistic situations like that.
Yes, yeah. Well, he had a whole article on Carnegie. He spent like 2 weeks discussing a book called Against Paternalism.
It's a very interesting way of looking at things here, because what we've covered here in Caplan's article is the moral arguments around following the law, and is the law itself moral? Comes up a bit in discussions. In the last, 20 years, behavioral economics has had a big look at the importance of defaults. So rather than operating on the basis that laws have morality, you can instead look at it to say the laws set the defaults, and that is a positive way that the state can act paternalistically and influence outcomes, even without getting the police to knock on your door and actually enforcing their monopoly on the use of physical force.
Yeah. Arrest you every time you go 3Ks over the speed limit. It means that I will only drive 3Ks over the speed limit and never get booked. Rather than left to my own devices, I may drive at 150 Ks an hour.
The role of paternalism itself is an interesting view as to how important should it be. And this is a nice wrap-up point for Caplan, because he's a guy who's specifically been awarded for writing against paternalism and absolutely hating it.
Yeah, that is where I disagree with him the most. Even just thinking back to my own life, like probably I would drive at 150, 160 Ks down that Hume highway, even in my tiny little Polo, because I have confidence in my abilities and I have a very modern car with good brakes and it's got all sorts of radars and stuff all over it. But part of that is the human's mind's ability to round down chances that are pretty close to zero to actually zero. And like I may be increasing my risk of death by driving at 150k from 0.001 every drive to 0.002. And so my, primitive monkey brain is like, well, so they're both zero. So I haven't changed it. But if you can be a state and average that across a population, you can see that, I don't know what the road toll is, but you can see that double the number of people die when we allow everyone to drive at 150k's an hour. And so we are saving 100 lives a year by reducing the speed limit.
Oh, well, there we go. I thought we were going to wrap the conversation, but you've just opened it up, because this was a thing that came up in Scott Aronson's post on coronavirus and the importance of the state acting with a utilitarian framework.
Yeah, yes, it definitely comes into that. And it brings back to the Copenhagen interpretation of ethics. To expand on our previous points, and this is going to be a jump about podcast, so I hope you all can keep up, or I hope that I am extremely good at editing this so it flows quite nicely. There does seem to be an attitude within the inertia of the healthcare and government organization that coronavirus is just a thing that is happening, and something like 3,500 people per day are dying in the United States, but that's just part of the world. So as long as we don't interact with it, we are not to blame, and that is just a thing that will happen. If we were to rush the vaccine out and one person per million were to get a horrible side effect and die from the distribution of that vaccine, we would now be to blame. And people would say, why did you rush that vaccine? Why didn't you go through the proper safety checks and stop this 1 in a million person dying? And if you look at the entire United States of America, that means 300 people would die from that 1 in a million chance versus 3,500 people per day currently dying from coronavirus. But because one of them would be our fault because we didn't properly vet the vaccine, and one of them is a fact of the world, those 3,500 lives seem to take on less of a moral weight in the decision-making calculus than the 300 that you could potentially kill by not screening for that 1 in a million chance.
Yes.
Yes.
I have nothing to add there. That was just an extremely familiar conversation to me because I think you said exactly that in the previous podcast. So it's good to just really keep hammering it home.
We can keep circling back. This is where a government should be a utilitarian. I know it is a very difficult mindset. Again, I have dealt with tragedy in my life, and it would be incredibly difficult for me. And it still is. Like, I'm raising money for cancer charities where plausibly I could save more lives by sending anti-malarial bed nets to the third world. But having something so close to me is just so important that I can't focus on anything else. But there is a very good argument that the state should be more utilitarian in its approach to saving lives, which will mean that some people die as a result of state action because more people are saved elsewhere.
Yeah, I think actually it's a great framework for looking at things, and the difficulty becomes when you start scratching at the surface of this. Governments are made of people, just like corporations are made of people. Especially with governments, it's very easy to see those individual people who are making the decisions and hold them to account like a person, where we expect them to behave with virtue or to save face or to act within the framework of care ethics. We hold them accountable at that personal level, but they are acting as a part of the government, which should be acting in a utilitarian function.
I mean, assuming you subscribe to utilitarian ethics, which I, would say are 95% plus do.
I'm kind of there. I believe that different entities within the world should operate within different ethical frameworks. And maybe this is a bit around the default assumptions that we talked. I assume that people should, and I hold people accountable to, common sense morality. So having bias towards the ones they love, especially, this is a common framework, doing things that kind of make sense. When people come together to form an organization, I expect things differently from that organization and how the people act within that organization to how they act as individual people. And I think that can end up with a better world to live in, I suppose. And the better world to live in would be, I get to deal with people on a one-to-one level, and I get to deal with them as people. And, I get all the social benefits from that, and I'm a happy person. But at the same time, I live in a society that benefits from all these utilitarian calculations going on, that continues optimizing, that has economic growth, that extends people's lifespans, et cetera, et cetera. And the world itself gets better while I also get to enjoy being a person.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to look at things, and that it's not actually very enjoyable to act strict utilitarian, and you will alienate a lot of your friends and you will make yourself very sad. It is definitely, on balance, definitionally almost better to live in a society where something utilitarian is trying to pull the levers and make things as better as possible for the most number of people as possible through saving lives, increasing standard of living, however.
The tricky part of that obviously becomes, well, what are all the errors in those utilitarian calculations, and what are you actually trying to optimize the utility of, which gets into the different state calculuses of, well, was the Nazi state good, and was communist states good? Is the Australian state good? I don't know.
They're just optimizing for their own internal, Hitler's own internal view of what the perfect world looks like, and quite utilitarian about it. But yes, it just turns out to be horrendous.
The world's complicated and it's tricky, but at a ground level, I think those kind of basic assumptions around ethics are still subscribe to them, but there's always going to be wiggle room within it.
Sure, and there's always a conflict between what I can rationally say is the utilitarian thing that I should do and what I actually want to do. And I don't know, I'll usually go with what I actually want to do and rationalize it out later.
Yeah, love it. All right. Next topic. I want to call out a massive thank you to Chris for giving me an awesome recommendation for the Very Bad Wizards podcast. Awesome recent podcast. They had an interview with Agnes Callard from the University of Chicago discussing in depth a particular writing from Plato called the Gorgias. But more generally, what this did for me was just unlock an understanding or a way of looking at ancient philosophy that I never had before.
And so I don't know whether we've done this on a published episode, but Bryan actually reads a lot of the ancient philosophy. He's reading, what is it called? The Great Conversation, which is the school of Western thought from Socrates through Greek, Roman, through the Middle Ages, through Renaissance, up to some modern philosophers. And it's this, what is it, a 20-year project in theory with about 12 books a year?
It's a 10-year reading list where you read about 20 books a year or selected readings from the books. I'm about a year and a half through it. I've read a few other things that are in the future of the reading list as well, just as part of general interest. And yeah, some of the stuff I've struggled with the most, to be perfectly honest, was the stuff I started with, especially ancient Greek philosophy, the writings of Aristotle, Plato, a few other different authors there. The plays are fantastic. Yeah, the writings of Plato especially. I think I've read the Republic twice. I've read 3 of his other works, Phaedo, Apology, and something else. And I just always struggled with it in terms of just the way it was written. They're bad writers. They bring up points where it's just like, okay, here's a counterpoint to you. And you read it and you're like, that is the worst counterpoint. Why are you just conceding it? Why are we going with this other bad assumption? This is just awful. So a clear point of it comes in the Phaedo, which is Socrates is talking about why he believes there's an afterlife. and going through these different arguments and what's the nature of the soul. And one of his counterparties in the conversation makes the argument that the soul or your consciousness is just a harmony. So it's a bit like a tuning on a string. When it is all in the perfect balance and you're making the harmonic sound, that is what consciousness is, a harmony of organic matter that allows you to perceive life. And I'm like, that's a great argument. And Socrates' argument against it is, well, I've actually got this other principle, which is that learning is just remembering. And if you assume that it is a harmony, then it doesn't fit with this principle of remembering. And here's the principle of remembering, and you agree with this, don't you? And he comes up with an example, like teaches some kid how to calculate the hypotenuse of a triangle. And I'm just like, no, that's a terrible example. What are you doing? And this comes up again and again and again in Plato's writings on Socrates. And the thing that Agnes Callard did in this conversation was say, well, just imagine that these Socratic dialogues are like a podcast, or it's like an actual conversation. We haven't abandoned the form whatsoever. It's not that these writings are bad. It's just these were written down conversations, and conversations tend to flow like that. People will concede points rather than just be an
Sure. Or, stop the conversation for half an hour while they go research something.
Yeah, exactly. So it was just a lot of fun. It was like I had all these learnings just floating around in my mind. I was kind of frustrated with it. It was like a super cooled bit of water. And just this one insight that Agnes Callard dropped in there just crystallized it all. And it all just suddenly unlocked. I'm like, oh my God, I get Plato now.
Nice.
And this is something that's been sitting around for 10 years. So thank you very much for that, Chris.
Excellent. Well, I found it enjoyable, but I certainly didn't get as much out of it as you, because I tried to read Homer and I got halfway through the Iliad before I'm like, this is bad. I don't like it.
I agree. Homer, the Odyssey's okay.
Yeah, maybe I should try the Odyssey. I just found the Iliad very tedious.
If anyone out there tries to read the Iliad and you get to the second chapter with the boats, just skip it. Just skip it. It adds nothing.
It is not a good chapter. It is like a half hour of just name checking, because I'm assuming that all the Greeks that were being told this story were related to someone who sent boats, and they could be like, Dad, that was my dad. My dad sent 10 black ships with 4 masts each and 20 slaves per boat or whatever. It is a whole chapter of just listing out someone's name and how many ships they sent on the war. It's so boring.
The only other thing I can think of, and I don't know anything about Greeks, so I haven't researched this at all, is maybe it was like a sweet rap. It's just like, all right, I'm going to break up this thing with a sweet rap about like 8 beach black boats and 9 beach black boats and blah, blah, blah. And it's like a sweet rap in the middle of nothing. But that's just a theory.
There are a few people who, when trying to translate the Greek, do try to put it into a more of a verse, a meter kind of thing. Apparently the ancient Greek, if you say it out loud, does have a real rhyming, poetical kind of vibe to it, which is hard when you're translating it into something I can't actually understand, obviously.
Yeah. And just to wrap on this, I strongly recommend anyone who's going to try and do the challenge of reading The Great Conversation, or even just reading a few of the old Plato books. I often find reading these books, it's great to just skip all the introductory that the translator's done, read through the book, and then go back and read the translator's notes before it, and that gives you a better appreciation of it. Similar with this conversation with Agnes Callard. I think having read Plato before and then listening to it, I don't know, Chris seemed to get a lot out of just listening to it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a good podcast. And I will say, part of the problem of getting into this world is it seems like you're either not into it at all, which I am, or you're like super duper deep into it and you've got all these assumptions. So when I try to read these introductions to the Iliad, they're like referring to 7 other translations of the Iliad, which I've obviously already read, because who's going to read this other than a scholar who's interested in ancient Greek works? And I'm like, I'm just trying to read the Iliad, man. You don't have to refer to the 7 other translations that I'm never going to read. I chose yours.
Yeah, it's a tricky one to get into for sure. There's a high barrier to entry and they just assume you're working in a university.
They pretty much do.
Hearing this conversation, it kind of makes me wish I did go to a university and do this stuff rather than just slam my head against the wall and teach myself.
Well, I think I've remarked to you this before, but on Very Bad Wizards, they've said repeatedly, like, doesn't matter which translation of Plato you read. The important thing is that you discuss it with someone, and you barely do that. Sometimes you discuss it with me, but I haven't read it, so I have no idea what we're talking about.
Oh, yeah, that was the other way of looking at these Socratic dialogues, which was don't look at them like it's going to have concrete messages for you to learn. Ethics has not been solved. They sure as heck didn't solve it 2,500 years ago. What these are doing is just raising questions for you to ponder further. So Plato himself may not have even subscribed to a lot of these points. Some of the theories that he lays out there, he would have held pretty weakly. Even things put forth as strongly and still held onto today, like the myth of the cave or the theory of forms. I'm not going to get into the detail of those. People can look them up. Even those things, they're just ideas for you to ponder. So don't go into the books thinking you're going to learn a heap. All you're going to do is actually have a whole bunch more to think about on your own time. And that was a really nice way of looking at it as well.
Sure, and probably why the conversations after reading those books are quite so valuable. Like this conversation.
Well, last time we went with Diablo 2 first, so this time we're going to go with the coffee bets update.
All right, well, coffee bets update. So there has been a coffee bet closed. So last week we coffee bet about how this New South Wales outbreak is going to go. We initially bet that the pandemic would be considered over at less than 10 cases a day average for 3 days. And Bryan generously allowed me to amend that to 5 for a 3-day average, which we got to exactly 5, but 5 is not less than 5. So it still rolls. And I think everyone in Australia is still feeling that it's still rolling. The borders are closing, etc. Fortunately, we haven't got anywhere near the 70 that I thought we might get to, and I dearly hope that we won't. It feels like we're sort of getting things under control. Christmas was a little dicey. New Year's was probably a bit dicey, though we won't know about that for a while. That one's still rolling. But we did have a bet from earlier in the year, because I like a good coffee bet, around the infection fatality rate of COVID. And again, we made this bet, I reckon, in early May, when fatality rates were thought to be somewhere around 5%, 1%, 5%, 10% maybe. And based on our readings, we both thought it was substantially lower than that. I thought 0.5%, Bryan thought 1%, so we split the difference and said 0.75% would be our threshold. And from all of the data that I've read, which I linked to Bryan a lot, it would seem, I reckon, the average is around 0.3, 0.4% once you account for actual populations kind of thing. It varies wildly based on age and hospital support, I suppose, but it would seem that if you average it across everyone, it's around the 0.3, 0.4%, which is good. And that means I win a coffee.
You winner.
Hooray!
When we made the bet, there was no way. The published statistics on it just seems so much worse. What were we talking? WHO was estimating 5 to 10% or something like that?
Yeah.
So whatever. In the grand scheme of things, coffee's not much, and I'm also happy to concede it. It does make me feel a bit worse about the public reactions to it, but, whatever. I can only imagine, geez, if they had these published statistics back in March when we were talking about lockdowns, pushback would have been so much harder.
Yeah, a 0.7 or a 0.3 or 0.4% death rate is clearly still enough to kill a lot of people, unfortunately. So maybe a little bit of induced panic was a good thing, perhaps.
I think it's just a burn-through rate, like the amount that it infects people and how quickly that it does. The percentages don't matter so much because you're still having a really high absolute toll.
Yeah, as has been remarked before, it's maybe 2 or 3 times deadlier than the flu, which is pretty bad, but it's like so much more infectious that it is just, it's sweeping through everyone. And when it gets into nursing homes or hospitals, it's truly, truly terrible.
You know how last time we were talking about selling all our stocks?
Yeah, selling all our stocks.
And being super worried about it. We didn't talk about the other side of the worry. And I'm super worried about inflation at the same time. It's like I'm so worried that asset prices are going to fall because it's a bubble. But at the same time, I'm also worried that the asset prices are going to keep rising because there's just money getting pumped out there.
I mean, this literal exact thought is part of what caused me to buy a house. I'm like, there's just so much money going out that hard assets are going to appreciate regardless of the underlying fundamental. There's just going to be more money around and more of it's going to be tied up in houses.
So I don't know, what's the inflation statistics? When's the next one published?
Oh, bet on inflation. That sounds good.
RBA.gov. Latest inflation was published September 2020, was 0.7%.
Annualized or quarterly?
Year ended, so it's annualized.
0.7.
Yep.
God damn.
In March, it was 2.2. So this year, it's dropped significantly because the RBA only do quarterly. So are you feeling it's going to be high? Are you feeling it's going to be low?
Inflation has made no sense to me for a while. It just definitely feels like classical economic theory says it should be spiking hugely, but it's not. And possibly that's just because we've had the expectation set that inflation will always be 1 to 2% for a decade or two. Like reserve banks actually do a really, really good job of controlling inflation. And now they can just credibly commit to controlling inflation. And everyone will be like, well, they're going to fix the inflation anyway, so we won't bother inflating anything ourselves. But what's my favorite stat at the moment? 20% of all US dollar bills ever printed were printed in 2020. So for the entire history, 200 plus years of United States greenbacks existing, 20% of all that money was printed last year in the form of stimulus or to help with the economic impacts of coronavirus. It just has to involve inflation, right? It can't. I don't see how it can possibly not.
Yeah, there was an interesting point in the Jolly Swagman podcast, his year in review of 2020, where he was interviewing a senior fund manager. The senior guy was talking around. It's kind of like a similar theory to quantum mechanics. Everything you read about how to address inflation and come out of liquidity traps and just pumping dollars out of a reserve bank into the asset markets, eventually it'll trickle down. It doesn't make intuitive sense. But if you look at all their workings, you can't find fault with it. And the longer and longer that we stay in this low inflation environment and the more and more money that gets pumped out there, the more I get worried that there's going to be a sudden snap when the world comes into line with their models.
Yeah. It's going to be, I don't know, what do we get, stagflation for the 70s again?
And similarly, there was a link from Tyler Cowen at Marginal Revolution earlier this week. I think it was Simon Dedier was predicting that the left itself is going to move further and further away from a capitalistic viewpoint and probably just address taxation through inflation, just like keep pumping money out there. And that just adds more weight to the recent considerations of inflation that I've had.
Yeah, everything I know feels like we should be in for huge inflation, but it's not happening and plausibly that's what's happening with asset prices. That's why the share market is still at all-time highs in the US, I think. Like, we've had the worst year, I don't know, maybe not the worst year in living memory, because there's still people who fought through World War II alive, but the worst year in my memory, certainly. We should not have an increase in the stock market based on fundamentals on that. That feels like it has to be a lower purchasing power of money.
Yeah, definitely. So anyway, we've got to turn this into a coffee bet somehow. How long term do we want?
I like a 2-year bet. I like having a few in the future to look forward things so that we can just have this on record for a while.
Okay, so do we want to get the peak quarterly inflation for 2021? They've only published 2020 up to September right now.
Yep.
So by the time we got the results, it'd be mid-2021.
Okay, sure. All right, so the highest quarter of annualized inflation in 2021 in Australia.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to say over 3%.
Okay, over 3%. That's nice and moderate. I think that's fair based on that. I kind of want to push you up a little. I'm going to take the low side of this bet.
Well, you're allowed, like, that's how I think this should work, is like, I'll throw out 3% and you're like, you're crazy, Chris. I'll take the high side of that bet in a heartbeat kind of thing. And I'm like, well, would you take the high side of a 3.5% bet? Would you take the high side of a 4% bet? And then we can find somewhere that we agree that I would take either side of this bet. Or you're firmly on one camp and I'm firmly in the other.
Yeah, I think like my point of indifference is around 4%.
4%. You reckon we can get over 4% with 50-50 chance? What's the highest quarterly inflation going back to 2000?
Well, that's a good point. They've actually really improved the Reserve Bank of Australia's side on this. Going back to 2000, the highest one seems to be March. It's all in 2008. Well, it was just before the big crash in 2008. Oh, heck, even then. So the highest was September 2008 with a consumer price inflation of 5%.
5%? Okay, so there has been 5% in my adult lifetime. That honestly surprises me.
Yeah, it's been like since then, since 2008, the highest it has been 3.5%.
Okay.
And that was in 2011. And since then, it's never broken 3.
2011. Hasn't broken 3 since 2011. That's probably what I'm thinking, because that's probably wasn't until I met you that I started thinking about economics terribly thoroughly. I might have listened to Free Economics a little bit. So that's why 3 seems crazy high to me. But maybe 4 is more reasonable for a slightly longer time horizon. Like 10 years isn't that long in the scheme of an economy.
Well, now that I've looked at this, I'm willing to move down to 3.5.
3.5 feels like something I could take the over or the under on, I reckon. I'll go the high side. I'll take over 3.5%. I want to win a coffee.
I'll be generous and say 3.5% or over.
Ooh, all right. So 3.5 or above, as determined by the RBA published quarterly inflation as of December 2021. So if any of the next 4 quarters get over that 3.5 number, I will win a coffee. All right, well, that was technical and niche and interesting. So let's talk about Diablo to do completely the opposite to that.
Yeah, everyone's into Diablo, right?
I mean, really just you and like 5 other people?
It's up to 2,000 people on Ryu Kezakotl's streams.
Oh, that's a bit.
Holy cow. Okay, what do you know? There is actually a new world record as of today.
Today, a world record was set. A world record, the fastest ever.
I couldn't believe it. I was going to talk about some others that were set earlier in the week. Maybe not that many people have pushed that hard on these over the years.
Also, how many world records are there? Like 100?
Oh, there's easily. So what have we got? We've got softcore, hardcore, players 1, players X, players 8, and then 7 different characters.
Right.
So 2 times 3 is 6 times 7. No, actually, I'm doing that wrong. Yeah, anyway.
Yep. This is why I make such a big deal out of world records, because there's so many of them. They do seem to fall on about a weekly basis in my experience, maybe more often. Tell me which world record was set this week.
So this is any percent normal. So it's just beating the first difficulty in the game. So Diablo has 3 different difficulties. Each time you play through the exact same set and storyline, it just gets harder each time you play through it. So normal, nightmare, hell. The category is softcore. So if your character dies, you just start again in the town that you were up to. In hardcore, if your character dies, you have to start the whole game from scratch.
Back from level 1. Ouch.
So this is the easy mode, softcore. This is the optimized version of the players count. This is called Players X.
Ooh.
So when playing single player, you can pretend that you're playing online by typing in a command called players. And what that does is it increases the enemy's damage that they do to you, increases their life, and also increases the experience your character gets. So you level up faster as you're playing through by choosing, which areas to make harder to kill the enemies in.
Right, so you can adjust it on the fly.
Exactly. So this is Players X, and it is is the Paladin class. So this is the righteous warrior who typically just beats people with a mace at the start and then sends out magic hammers flying at the end. New world record just today. Username is 327. Took them 1 hour, 40 minutes, and 45 seconds to complete the game.
That's pretty quick.
It's pretty quick. It's definitely quicker than I could do. I've done a any percent normal players 1 Paladin speedrun myself before. It took me 3 hours, 50 minutes.
Oh, really? More than double.
More than double. So very quick. To compare that to the fastest anyone's done any class, let me check. So 48 minutes, 58 seconds is Hardcore Players X Sorceress by Indrek, and Softcore... Well, there you go. Hardcore is actually faster.
Yeah, right. I mean, technically, there's probably not much difference because if you die on softcore, you've probably ruined the run anyway.
Yeah, there's a couple of little optimizations you can do by dying, but if you're just good enough, it doesn't matter. So there you go, new world record. Maybe I'll go and check it out if I can deal with watching Twitch ads, which, oh my God, Twitch in Australia, it makes me want to actually subscribe to people because you just see the same ad 20 times. Could I just watch some ads for Temptations cat treats or something? Come on. So there you go, world records. They happen.
They happen on a surprisingly regular basis. I guess that keeps you involved. What's the closest you would be to a world record?
Me? I don't know. Frame it in what way?
You personally playing the percentage over the world record for whatever category you're running?
Probably that Paladin one.
Okay. Your best is 200%, 220%, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, man, these guys are really good, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. So there we go. That's Diablo 2, and that's the podcast for this week.